So today we're going to try to answer the question of what a secular Buddhist practice might look like, and how it would differ, might not differ from a traditional practice. Coming right up. So I'm Doug Smith. I'm study director at the Secular Buddhist Association. That's secularbuddhism.org. If you're new to the channel and interested in living a wiser and a kinder and a less stress-filled life, consider subscribing. So the heart of Buddhism is practice. And this is somewhat different, let's say, from Christianity, which is a religion that some people will compare to Buddhism because it's the most prevalent within the West, at least. And in Christianity, it's more about belief. It's more about credo. The idea being that salvation is through faith and not through deeds in Christianity. Which is not to say that there isn't such a thing as very deep Christian practice. But as a comparison, practice is somewhat less important. In Buddhism, practice really is the heart of what Buddhism really is. And the same is true for anybody who is a secular Buddhist, at least of all the ones that I know. As a secular Buddhist, you're just as interested in practice. Practice is really the heart of what you do. That's why you consider yourself a Buddhist or a secular Buddhist. Or I should say it's why a secular Buddhist would consider themselves Buddhist is because of their Buddhist practice. And we'll get to that. But why they would consider themselves secular, that really is more an issue of belief. Because the difference between being secular and being traditional is really what kinds of beliefs you have. A secular practitioner of Buddhism will generally have a more this life kind of orientation. That is to say, they're going to be less interested in the claims that we have in Buddhism about future lives or past lives. They're going to be less interested in the claims of Buddha that we find in traditional Buddhism about a karma, effective karma, sort of making a difference in our future lives. It's guaranteeing certain kinds of results. They're going to be less interested in some of the more speculative kind of supernatural aspects that we find in traditional Buddhism, such as the supposed abilities of the Buddha that happen when you become awakened. These kinds of things, for most secularists, are of less interest. That's sort of why they consider themselves secular. But I think, to put it in a nutshell, a secular Buddhist is going to have a this life orientation towards Buddhism, towards the practice. So again, this is an issue of views and belief rather than practice itself. But in all of this, what we have to say is that secular Buddhism isn't a fixed thing. There is no definition. There's no easy definition of what makes somebody a secular Buddhist. There's no definition in any of what I'm going to be talking about. It's something that's being made up as we go along in the mid to late 20th century into the 21st century. This, of course, the roots of secular Buddhism go back really quite a long ways, and I've tried to discuss some of that in these videos. A Buddhism that's called secular Buddhism, that uses those terms, is something that's really fairly recent. And so there's not a definition. It's kind of a family resemblance between different kinds of approaches, this life approaches to practice. Now, when we turn to practice, what actually are the practices that a secular Buddhist would use? Well, they're basically the same as a Buddhist would use. The secular Buddhist is going to follow the Eightfold Path, for want of a better example. They're going to follow, right view and right intention. They're going to follow right speech and right action, right livelihood. They're going to follow right effort. They're going to follow right mindfulness, and they're going to follow right concentration. So they're going to follow the whole of the Eightfold Path. There's really no difference between a secular Buddhist approach and a traditional approach, at least on that kind of view. That said, there also are certain aspects of traditional practice that in general tend to be of less interest to most people who consider themselves secular. So, for example, the use of images and rituals, which can be really the heart of many traditional practices that are very ritual-based, very image-based, in particular using, let's say, statues of the Buddha. I've got one behind me here. Clearly, I'm not that doctrinaire here, because, I do have images of the Buddha, which is a traditional kind of element of practice. And I did a video about this topic a while back, which I'll put a link to up here on the screen. You can watch that if you want more detail. But in general, the response, I think, would be that if you find images and rituals to be useful to you in this life, to your practice in this life, to be helpful to you in promoting non-clinging and non-identification, to promoting equanimity in this life, perhaps as a source of inspiration to you, then there's nothing in a secular Buddhist practice that would say that's not allowed. I mean, of course, it is allowed. There's no right and wrong here. It's simply finding what you find as useful to you in bringing your practice forward. Now, for some people, of course, images and rituals will promote clinging in themselves. They'll think, if I have a Buddha image, I'll begin to cling to my self-identification as a Buddhist, let's say. Or if I engage in certain kinds of rituals, I'll start clinging to those rituals and craving the rituals. If that's the case, then of course they're not going to be completely skillful for you. And so you'll have to work with that if you want to continue them. But nevertheless, that's one a problem, or these are some problems that secularists might see with traditional practice. There are also many devotional practices within traditional Buddhism. Devotion to the Buddha, devotion to bodhisattvas, devotion to many things, which, again, many secularists will find somewhat off-putting, that they're not going to particularly want to do those things. When I began as a secular Buddhist, and for many, many years, my feeling was that devotional practices required you to sort of have a belief in something like a god, because you're sort of debasing yourself in front of something. It has to be something that's extremely powerful, presumably, something that's extremely wise and good, and that if you're going to be doing these practices, you have to have that in mind. So that these kind of devotional practices almost necessitated a kind of religious, theistic kind of relationship. But I don't think that's really true anymore. I think there are certainly more nuanced ways of approaching a devotional practice in which you don't necessarily believe in a creator deity, you don't necessarily believe in any kind of supernatural stuff, and you don't necessarily believe in a future life, or at least you're agnostic about that. You may simply think that certain kinds of devotional practices, let's say, for example, prostrations, doing prostrations, which is a typical devotional practice, you might feel that those things help you dealing with your own pride, or dealing with your own arrogance, or your own conceit. Pride, arrogance, and conceit are real issues for many, most, or even all of us to an extent in daily life, in a this world practice, a this life practice. To the extent that simply engaging in certain kinds of physical motions may break down those tendencies towards us, in us, towards arrogance and pride and so on, then perhaps we may feel that a devotional type practice that involves prostrations is one that we should engage in. Because I think we all know that bodily motions that we engage in can have a mental effect. Simply smiling can put you into a better frame of mind. There's some research about this, very interesting research. And similarly, perhaps doing kinds of devotional motions may be also useful to us. So there are lots of ways that we can approach these. Now, they're not going to be appropriate for everybody, not going to be appropriate for all secular Buddhists. There are going to be many people who consider themselves secular who find them distasteful or off-putting or too religious in flavor. Perhaps they came from a more religious background, and these kinds of things turn them off, or remind them too much of a background that they want to put behind them. There's no right and wrong here. It's simply to say that there is a wide scope of potential practices for anybody within a secular sort of belief system, and so there's not necessarily going to be any difference if you're looking from the outside. Two people practicing in front of you in a Buddhist environment, you're not necessarily going to be able to tell who the secularist is and who the traditionalist is. And I would say in general that people who are interested in a more secular kind of practice environment are probably going to find insight centers. If we know about insight Buddhism or Vipassana Buddhism, there are insight centers around the world, and related kinds of centers, such as ones run by Goenka, who also runs a similar ran before he passed on. But the centers are still around, and these are centers that are somewhat less devotional, They're somewhat less ritualized. They're somewhat less hierarchical, although there's more of a hierarchy within Goenka centers because Goenka was sort of the guru, although he's not around anymore, as I say. So, but in any event, less hierarchical, less ritual-based, less devotional. And so I think in general, people who are at least somewhat feeling like they're not really interested in devotional practices and so on, they're going to find an insight center probably to be the most congenial. And it will be a center in which there are people of different beliefs and different backgrounds. You're going to have people who are traditional Theravada practitioners, and you're going to have a certain percentage, at least in the ones that I'm familiar with, who are also secular. So you're going to have a kind of a mixed group there. Zen is another possibility, because within the Zen tradition, beliefs of all kinds are sort of thrown into question, are things that we have to suspend belief in, if you like, during the practice. And to that extent, we're going to say we're going to throw all of our beliefs into question, including those that involve secularism and religious opinions, including, let's say, those that involve future lives. Although, again, traditional Zen practitioners generally do believe in future lives, nevertheless, it's in an environment in which questioning your beliefs, even down to their very core, is sort of the practice, or at least part of the practice. So again, within a Zen environment, we may also find a very fertile kind of place for many people of a secular kind of mindset. So I should say, I think I forgot to say at the beginning of this, that this discussion, this video today, was sort of, the reason for it is because of a question on one of my other videos, on question on women in Buddhism video by Keeper of Truth, who asked about what the differences between a secular and a traditional practice was. So I wanted to make this video because I really haven't done a video about the practice in particular. But I'd be interested in your view about how you practice. Do you follow a secular practice? Do you have anything you would add? Because I'm just giving, again, broad overview here, but there are going to be so many different cases, individual cases. And so it would be helpful, I think, if you could, put your own experiences down below. Or if you're not secular, if you have a traditional practice, how you see the difference. I'd be interested in all of these. And if you're interested in more kinds of issues surrounding secular Buddhism and early Buddhism, check out my Patreon page where I put up stuff every once in a while that I find interesting around the web, and where you can support the page, this whole effort if you are interested in doing so. And thanks so much to people who do, because it means a whole lot to me. And thanks so much to people who have commented in the past. Thanks to all of my long-time viewers. It's wonderful to have you back. So I hope we'll catch you on the next one of these videos. And meanwhile, do be well.